I think I need to do this from a studio.
All right, we're live. You are a bit echoey. All right, wait, hold on. And here we go.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's a real pleasure to be invited to speak at the Collegium. You know, for us, it's a really daunting task given the history of this gathering, but it's been really great for us to work together again. You know, there's something really crucial about doing philosophy in the context of friendship.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to speak at the Collegium, and I apologize for not being there in person, but my responsibilities here at Michigan State have kept me from joining you there. Given that you and I, Rick, developed our friendship in graduate school more deeply only after you left on a Fulbright in Poland, and we emailed regularly, it's somehow appropriate that our work here is again mediated by a digital encounter.
Yeah, and in relation to that, I've been thinking that there's something about De Anima that sort of gathers one and gathered us, if only digitally, together in an encounter with the text. But now I feel as though I'm channeling Reiner. You know, Reiner Schurman was one of the founders of the Collegium.
That's a little odd given his philosophical suspicion of foundations, grounds, and principles. I can hear his voice now. That story of me being a founder of the Collegium is metaphysical and very boring. I miss him. His absence remains, for me at least, extremely present.
Yeah, I feel it too. Sometimes I even hear his voice in my head. It's interesting because in rereading the text, I've been struck by the passage we referenced toward the start of our paper. Remember when Aristotle speaks of the value of inquiring into the nature of the soul? He says, and it seems that familiarity, gnosis, of it contributes, symbolistai, greatly toward all truth and especially to the truth concerning nature. For the soul is, in a certain sense, the principle of living things.
Now that you mention it, that passage contains some of the terms that were at the center of Schurman's thinking, aletheia, phusis, arche. For Schurman, though, these terms were crucial to another kind of gathering, one that's not so happy. Already in Heidegger on being and acting, but more so in Broken Hegemony, he was constantly concerned with the ways in which the positing of principles sets truth and phusis into order in ways that establish and perpetuate systems of violence and injustice.
Right. And, you know, Schurman himself, certainly following Heidegger, often pointed to Aristotle as the founder of a metaphysics that imposed the principles of human fabrication on the processes of nature in order to account for them in terms of causes. But here, at the beginning of the De Anima, Aristotle doesn't begin by positing a principle, but by our familiarity with the soul. This familiarity, or his word is gnosis, is for me itself perplexing because it opens an encounter with all truth, and then in particular and most of all with the truth concerning phusis. I kind of wish we had written our paper on this sentence.
But then my joke about founding turns out to be serious. We need to be worried about whether the soul posits principles.
And Schurman would be worried that this truth concerning phusis is a foundational one that produces a violent order.
You really do hear his voice. But it seems as if Aristotle is here expressing something crucial about psyche, about soul as a principle of living things. He seems to be acknowledging that whatever we might want to call truth or aletheia is encountered through what is called soul. Truth is not, we might say, out there, but neither is it in here, in the soul. It seems to me that he's pointing to the soul as the site of an encounter with the world, the site from which or in which truth appears. An encounter is an uncovering and an opening.
This isn't so easy to think through. So there's a gnosis, a familiarity with regard to the soul that opens onto or contributes to, maybe even comes together with, truth of all kinds and the truth of phusis. But it seems like there's a kind of logical progression here that must end with the soul as most familiar, or else there's an infinite regress. What I mean is that this gnosis of the soul is precisely what brings about the gnosis of all truth, and particularly the truth concerning phusis. But if we're now going to ask about what familiarity brings about the familiarity of the soul must be that which is most familiar. So I would say that Aristotle raises the situation of the familiar soul encountering a world, maybe that's aletheia, that then in some sense is seen as one's own.
So this text has, for us at least, a certain familiarity, not only because we hear Reiner's voice in it, but also because the soul is most familiar. So familiar, in fact, that it conditions our encounters with the world and with one another. It conditions our most intimate, self-reflective encounters with ourselves. This is probably why Aristotle says we should give primary place to the inquiry concerning the soul, and why he calls its objects better and more wonderful. Our familiarity with the soul at once enables us to encounter the world and hinders us from attaining the soul, the sort of objectivity philosophers and scientists have long coveted.
Yeah, but now I don't know whether to feel liberated from objectivity or trapped in a kind of all-absorbing subjectivity. When Aristotle says that the familiarity with the soul brings an encounter with all truth, he seems to be suggesting just such a kind of objectivity. But then Reiner's right in the end, that is metaphysical and boring. But I'm still thinking that there is something about this claim of Aristotle that leads in a different direction. If this familiarity, this gnosis, is an encounter, then truth does emerge in our familiarity with the soul. But that would have to mean that the truth is, as you said, not either in the soul nor out there, but is this encounter, this familiar engagement, or else we're stuck within our own soul. The soul must already be in the world and reaching out. But if this is the site of truth, the encounter of aletheia, then the world is reaching back to the soul. And it must be that in this way, Thesis does not mean something independent of the soul. The soul, we might say, is physiological.
It's funny that you should say that. It reminds me of something that I read in a book I stumbled upon in one of those small bookstores down at the New School. It's a bound photocopy of a set of 4 lectures Frederick Woodbridge gave in 1930 at Union College, and John Herman Randall edited it under the title Aristotle's Vision of Nature. In it, Woodbridge suggests that the key to Aristotle's psychology is the recognition that there is, as he says, a correlation between the powers of the soul and the natural conditions of their exercise. He points to that important passage from De Anima 429a17 that says something like, the ability to perceive is to that which is perceived as the ability to think is to that which is thought. He takes this to mean that for every power of the soul, there's an appropriate field of operation in nature. So in that sense, we're always already at home in the world because the world already conforms to our capacities to encounter it.
I feel like the notion of the nature of being appropriate to the soul. Sorry, let's take that again. By the way, when we're doing this, we're just going to have to cover those over. Anyhow, I like the notion of nature being appropriate to the soul, and vice versa. In one sense, it marks the fittingness of each one to the other. But there's, of course, still the Shermanian worry that the soul appropriates, that is, makes its own, what is actually radically non-identical to it. So familiarity read with appropriateness seems better suited.
Yeah, especially if we take what is appropriate as that which is most proper, what Heidegger calls das eigene, what is one's own.
Of course, you know that I'm going to push back against Heidegger. So let me just say that even in Latin, proprium, often translated as property, is what is one's own and what is fitting. And doesn't that already mark a difference? I only claim something as being my own when it is other than me.
Right. That which is one's own does not consolidate into simple identity. So the familiarity we have with our own souls announces already a certain opacity. It's familiar and yet strange.
Yeah. And if it weren't both, we wouldn't ever look into it. If it weren't familiar, we would be totally oblivious to it. If it weren't opaque, we would get the whole thing immediately all at once. But then this also has to hold for truth, all truth, and especially the truth concerning Thesis. So the soul is physiological in this complicated sense of familiarity and opacity.
Okay. But wait, did you notice how this strange familiarity we seem to have with the soul is said to contribute greatly to all truth?
I know we have at some point to get onto the paper, but let me just say, I learned from you that the verb Aristotle uses there is suggestive, symbolistai. I think you say that at its root is the idea of two things being thrown together. Don't you make a big deal out of the way Aristotle uses the word symbolon in your book on Aristotle and truth? If I remember correctly, you cite Eco, Umberto Eco there, who seems to have captured something important about the meaning of the symbol. He says something like, and I don't have it here, but two halves of the same thing, either one standing for the other, both becoming, however fully effective, only when they matched, only when they matched to make up again the original whole.
Hey, thanks, man, for recalling that. If we publish this paper, let's be sure to cite that text in the book. You know, we always need to help each other feed the citation index machine. But by using a symbolistai here, Aristotle seems to suggest that there's a symbolic connection between the familiarity we have with the soul and our access to truth. And Sherman would want, I imagine, to emphasize the manner in which this connection enjoins a kind of action. There are those two essays he published in the 1970s, one on symbolic difference and the other on symbolic praxis. As we question Aristotle's language here, we do well to remember what Reiner says in the first essay. I think I have it here. I'll grab it. The question of language will then strive to retrace steps going backward along the course of a privileged speaking, that which establishes a new way of existing in the listener. Symbols do this, he says. Maybe by questioning Aristotle's language, going backward along the course of privileged speaking, we'll discover new ways of existing. Perhaps we are here on the path of a kind of methodology of our paper. When we revise it, we should work that in.
Yeah, and to travel along that path with you a bit further, let's remember that for Reiner, such new ways of existing emerge as practices of reading. If I remember, he says later in that text something like, to read is to interpret, and to interpret is to exist in a new way. So the hermeneutical relation concerns our reality. And this I remember clearly, he says, for the text interprets us.
Yeah, the text interprets us. What if we let this text, this sentence with which we will begin our paper today, to interpret us through the performance of the paper itself? What if we took seriously what Sherman says in the second essay, the one on symbolic praxis, where he insists that the poetics of the symbol gives one something to do. Symbols create. Notice how he speaks in the plural here. He emphasizes the importance of this when he goes on to say, poetics does not speak of the symbol, but of symbols in the plural. Can't you even now hear him saying this? Poetics does not speak of the symbol, but of symbols in the plural.
Yeah, I remember. There was never a universal concept that he didn't want to pluralize and make different from itself in singulars.
But listen to what he says next. Hence, a poetics, the symbol, is not only impossible de jure, but furthermore...
Wait. I think I can remember this quote from memory. The poetics of symbols would be a mad attempt de facto, for the symbolic given is inexhaustible. The method forgoes universal discourse. It agrees to be multiple and without conclusion.
Yes, multiple and without conclusion. Do you think this crowd is going to be ready for a paper that is multiple without conclusion?
Do you think we're ready? Do you think we'll ever get to this paper?
Yeah, probably not, but both, probably not to both questions. But still, that passage is remarkable, and it suggests a kind of method for us. Actually, Sherman calls it glorious. You know, it was the 70s, and he wasn't long yet out of the monastery. He says, its glory, that is the glory of this poetic method, shall be that it attaches itself to certain symbols and brings their creative power to light.
Okay, but now let's return back to the de anima for a second and to the symbol of sumbale, because there's creative power in it too.
Yeah, it gestures to the throwing together of a certain familiarity with truth, but perhaps more deeply, the verb itself points to our own encounters with the soul. The symbol of this symbol seems to unsettle all our assumptions about the liberal subject, separate, independent, and free. It invites us to recognize ourselves as multiple.
Okay, but then go back to that point about the liberal subject and this constellation of terms: familiarity, symbol, and truth.
Okay, pause that for, can you pause for a sec?
Yep. Pause.
Okay, so there, I think we shouldn't say go back because I know you deleted that other stuff, so it's not really going back. I think you should say something like
Can you follow up?
yeah, then following up on the point about the liberal subject,
Okay.
or taking up your point or something like that. And then there was something earlier I
You
wanted
say
to,
more.
yeah, say more about. Okay. So, and then a little bit earlier, I felt like our conceit got a little away from us there. Um,
I think we need to say a little bit earlier. Um, we need to introduce the conceit earlier. The first time we mention, oh, but we have to get to the paper, I think it's too late.
yeah, right. And I think, okay, yes, but, and then I think I'm actually, oh, I think we ought not to, maybe I shouldn't say that whole thing about the citation index and all that. Like, because I feel like, first of all, it takes us away from our, I mean, it could be silly and fun, but it takes us away from our point. And also, um, it, uh, it's a little off with our conceit too, you know, because it's
Right.
still in this, the conceit that when we wrote that, the conceit was um, that uh, we were we were writing it together. You know, we were having this conversation when we were writing it together, when in fact now we're presenting it and we have this thing that we've written, right? So I think we ought to just get rid of that part.
Okay, done.
Okay.
All right, where were we though?
Yeah, we do need, and then we need to go through it, as you say in your note, and make it more talky. I mean, I'm not, um, but that's also okay too, in a way now, just on this read, right?
Yeah.
All right, I need to also find a better way to be able to read it and see you. That's another aspect of this.
Yeah, Skype I think is better at this because you could have it just pop up a tiny window with the other person. I mean, maybe you could. I don't
All right, all right. Well, let's keep going though. Hold on a sec. Now, where were we? I was about to start, right?
Yeah. So the way these terms fall together.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
All right. Wait. Let me. So I'm not going to say go. I'm going to count you down and on. Then you'll know when to go. And in 3, 2, 1.
The way these terms fall together in the sentence with which we began the paper suggests at once that the soul may be the site for the happening of truth, and that this site is irreducibly multiple, such that every attempt to appeal to a stable subject on the basis of which to access an unequivocal truth is delusional.
So what do you mean to suggest by emphasizing that the terms of the sentence fall together?
Well, actually, I was thinking of Emma Bianchi's work, both her book on the feminine symptom in Aristotle and her essay on Sherman, natal bodies, mortal bodies. She wrote that essay for the symposium we held on Sherman's work at Penn State. You remember that?
Yes, I do. And as I remember, she criticized Sherman for rejecting sexual difference as a category of philosophical analysis and his utter silence on matters of sexuality more generally.
Yeah, she and I never tire of laughing about the time when Sherman was on a panel with Drusilla Cornell and Jacques Derrida when she and I were in our first year at the New School. When Sherman dismissed them both for talking about sexual difference, he called the distinction, yet again, metaphysical and very, very boring.
All right. But still, the multiplicity of the subject and the falling together of the words we find in the 30 sentence are connected to the embodied nature of human life.
Yeah, Emma emphasizes the significance of the symptom in Aristotle. She says that symptoma is literally a falling together from sum, together, and pito, to fall. Anything that befalls one, a chance, a mischance, or a calamity.
Okay, but your own emphasis on the importance of attending to the way things are said in Aristotle, you make up the bizarre word, his legomenological method, seems to tell against this notion that words of the sentence just fall together by chance.
It's not that they fall together by chance, but that they're symptomatic in the sense Emma so beautifully traces in her book. Like Sherman, Emma emphasizes the plurality of principles, the multiple beginnings in Aristotle. For example, in talking about the nature of nature itself, or physis, Emma, wait, I have her text here. She writes, alongside the plurality of principles, we also is also the indeterminateness of matter, matter's lack of determinacy or boundary, horos, as well as the multiplicity of the beginnings or principles of motion. They appear as the symptoma of the cosmos, the chance occurrences falling together where they may, end quote from Emma. So falling together, the falling together of the words in our touchstone sentence at the heart of the de anima, at the start of the de anima, are themselves symptomatic of the peculiar multiplicity, not only the beginning of the investigation into the soul, but of the soul itself in its embodied relation to the world.
So here the soul seems to be something more like the site of our encounter with the world than it does like a determined and bounded phenomenon.
Right. It's like Donna Haraway suggests. Bounded individualism in its many flavors in science, politics, and philosophy has finally become unavailable to think with, truly no longer thinkable, technically or in any other way. That's what she says. In so many ways, Aristotle is the founder of bounded individualism, with his attempts to press for an understanding of primary ousia as separate and a this.
Sure, but we emphasized in our essay on use and logos in Aristotle that the term for this, logoti, contains a certain multiplicity. That too is a symptom, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a symptom that articulates with beautiful ambiguity the messiness of our embedded and embodied nature. Familiarity with this symptomatic multiplicity should indeed contribute greatly to all truth, and especially to truth concerning nature.
Well, I'm glad you returned us to that touchstone passage, because at some point we're going to have to get on with delivering this paper, which now I think we're going to have to cut on the fly because we're 20 minutes into our time. But just let me say before we do, that you're pointing to the work of Emma and Haraway reminds me of a later passage in the De Anima from book 2, I think it's in maybe chapter 2, where Aristotle says something like, since the living thing is the composite of form and matter, it's not the body that is the actuality of the soul, but the soul is the actuality of the body. But then he goes on to say, of a certain body, a somatos tinos. Now, we might focus on the fact that the soul is the actuality of the body, and therefore the body is in potency without the soul. But I think we shouldn't forget the second part. The soul seems to require a certain kind of body. In a strange kind of way, we might say that the soul as actuality is only itself potential, till it encounters a certain kind of body.
Yeah, there's a strange bidirectionality of actuality and potentiality there. And if I remember correctly, Aristotle then goes on to emphasize how others have spoken beautifully about this issue in the past, saying something like, those who think the soul neither has being without a body nor is any sort of body take it up beautifully, for it is not a body, but something that belongs to a body. And this is why it's It is present in a body and in a body of a certain kind. En somati toi uto. And those demonstratives, tinos in your passage, toi uto in mine, emphasize the material dependency the soul has on the sort of body in which it appears. Emma might suggest that the repetition of those demonstratives is symptomatic, and the symptom to which they point would require us to rethink Aristotle's so-called essentialism, and that might take us the rest of our time.
Okay. I know we have to get onto the paper, but I think it's worth pursuing this issue briefly, because we do touch on it in the paper and we can come back to it in the discussion. My point in calling attention to this passage was to emphasize that there's a belonging together of body and soul. And frequently, Aristotle indicates that the whole point of soul, one is tempted to call it the very telos of the soul, is bodily. Aristotle says, for example, that plants possess the power of nutrition only. Other living things possess this and also the power of sensation. But these are powers of the soul, and yet they have to do with nutrition and reproduction. So in a real sense, the soul is for, or at least belonging to necessarily, the body.
But wait, since the soul is what opens us onto truth, wouldn't this then require us to undertake a different approach to truth or to aletheia? What I mean is that these powers of the soul open the body to something other than itself. If we look at nutrition, for example, the soul encounters the world, finds something, brings it back, and makes it the body's own. We might even say a similar thing about perception. But in this, there's a dimension that needs to be emphasized. What is encountered is, by definition, other than me as soul and body. In this way, the soul is a site of encounter because it's an opening of the world to us and of us to the world. But an opening that, as Adorno might argue, always and necessarily has a moment of non-identity.
So are you referencing your own words? Because in Aristotle on the Nature of Truth, you talk about aletheia as involving what you say is a kind of noticing. You say something like, it points to a way of encountering that is awake and alive to that which shows forth. It names a specific way of being, opening to the appearing of things, to the phenomenon. So this activity, the active verb eletheuein, already presupposes or carries along with it the soul as the site of this encounter, because the soul is the principle of being awake and being alive. But when we bring this notion of truth back to the soul, when we see the soul as nothing but embodied, then the notion of truth and the notion of the soul, I would say, becomes materialist.
Okay, so now I think you're referencing your own words. So in the thought of matter, I have it right here. I think you call materialist a philosophy that not only prioritizes the otherness of matter to thought, but also thinks the relation of thought to matter so as to allow a critical engagement. That's what your text says. Well, what constitutes materialism, you say, is the way it is, quote, necessarily caught between what is given, and that will always be material, and its mode of being given, and that is never graspable except by thought.
So I wasn't thinking of that at the time, but this is actually part of what I was trying to suggest by appealing to a different approach to truth. There's several moments that belong to such an approach. I think first is the moment where something shows forth, what you referred to as the phenomena. Yet simply showing forth isn't aletheia, that's phanestai. But the second moment noticing, which involves a way of being open to what is showing forth.
But your emphasis on materiality suggests that we're always caught between what is given and its mode of being given, between, we might now say, the first and second moment of truth. This suggests a third, which may in fact be before the first two, namely, there is an encounter, a going out to the world as the world reaches back. Might we call that encounter itself psyche?
Okay, but can I pull you back to Aristotle's text for a moment? If the soul contributes, as he says, to all truth, then, as you were saying, we can't remove it from an account of truth in Aristotle. The coming into unhiddenness, aletheia, happens always in relation to a soul. Understanding the operations and unfolding of the soul will then, according to him, help us understand truth in general. That seems to be Aristotle. And yet, he goes on to specify and particularize the contribution that familiarity with the soul makes to truth. That is, it contributes particularly to the gnosis of phusis. This is a claim I never noticed before, even while we were writing our paper.
Okay, if we start down that road of talking about the relationship between living, life, zoe, and phusis, that would certainly take the rest of our time and we'll never get to the actual paper. So maybe we should begin the paper. All right. Aristotle's De Anima is the story of an encounter. It begins in wonder, for Aristotle has experienced something beautiful and honorable. These are the very words with which the text opens. Beautiful and honorable we take knowing to be. You see, Rick, how I had to butcher the English a bit to make the sentence begin with beauty and honor as the De Anima itself begins?
Yeah, I've seen it, but we finally got to the paper, so don't stop now.
Okay, but let me just point out that the word Aristotle uses for the knowing he finds so beautiful and honorable is an iteration of the familiar word he uses at the beginning of the Metaphysics when he emphasizes that all humans desire to know. This word is eidonai. As Hannah Arendt rightly recognized, it means to have seen, eidonai being derived from the verb idain, to see. So Arendt says that, quote, to see is idain, to know is eidonai, that is to have seen. First you see, then you know, she says. Aristotle begins the De Anima delighting precisely in the experience of having seen, in the knowing that arises from an encounter with the soul. And he goes on to characterize this encounter as a kind of familiarity, a gnosis, that contributes especially to the truths of nature, phusis.
Okay, good, because this helps set up the question of truth in Aristotle and the concern about how truth unfolds in relation to nature, phusis, that we deal with in the paper.
Yeah, by emphasizing Aristotle's own experience of having seen the soul and his delight in it, we open a way to think about the connection between the soul and the natural world it encounters, or perhaps it might be better to say the natural world we encounter through the soul. How we formulate that is important, for strictly speaking, it's not the soul that encounters the world, but we who encounter the world through the soul. And if this is the case, then a distinction opens between the self and the world, with the soul acting always as a kind of medium. I haven't thought this through completely, but it might, but it may be this encounter, as we've discussed, is embodied, and so the knowing associated with it can't be divorced from the embodied nature of the encounter.
And yeah, in addition, so much has been said about the limits of the metaphysics of vision, in which the metaphor of sight too easily gives rise to the misperception that knowing is a kind of disembodied activity, and as such is based on the male.
Yeah, but by emphasizing the lived experience of having seen and characterizing the De Anima itself as the story of an encounter, we're able to uncover another dimension, perhaps even an affordance of the metaphysics of vision and its dependence on form or eidos separate from matter.
Right. Seeing as Aristotle tells us when he considers it in Book 2, sight is an embodied activity of perceiving that requires both matter of a certain sort, not just any heap of flesh is capable of seeing, and it requires a medium of light.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the essay we wrote back in 2001 that said about rethinking the nature of principles. There we talked about a parametaphysics that runs alongside and within the history of metaphysics, calling into question the legitimacy of subsuming a variegated tradition under a single overarching principle.
It's hard to believe that was 17 years ago.
Yeah, we're getting old, my friend. It still holds up, though, don't you think?
Well, I have to say yes. And by the way, by following a path opened by a parametaphysical story about vision, perceiving, and the metaphors of language that, the metaphors of knowing that come to language in Aristotle's encounter with the soul, we might just deepen our understanding of the living self and its engagement with the natural world.
Well, you're always inviting me to return to the text and the way the text begins to point in this direction, particularly as it moves so quickly from knowing as having seen to knowing as familiarity or gnosis. This familiarity with nature, however, is mediated by an encounter with the soul. Perhaps it's possible to suggest that awareness of the soul first emerges in our encounter with the natural world. And if so, then we will have seen the soul, known it, only in and through our embodied encounters with natural things. Isn't this sort of an interchange that Peirce called secondness?
Well, so here I think you're recalling a number of encounters we've had together. An encounter we had together with Dick Bernstein about the importance of pragmatism as a philosophical contribution, an encounter you've had with the pragmatic traditions reading Aristotle, and your encounter with my reading Peirce.
Yeah, all that's true, but I was thinking more of your most recent insistence on the significance of Peirce in relation to thinking matter, but all the more so rethinking so-called structural realities like race, gender, and class. That's when you presented the importance of Peirce's categories of secondness.
I think you're actually pushing us further into the De Anima in ways that Peirce probably didn't even see. But I smell what you're stepping in. If I set out from Aristotle's text, I would say that Aristotle insists that the living thing, that is, what can be said to be ensouled, is counted as such because it encounters the world and, as we've already said, engages in an exchange, an interchange with the world.
Yeah, but now that we've mentioned Peirce, I'm thinking that this interchange is itself a praxis. I mean, this is not just in the sense that it's an action and a doing, but also in the sense that it's inserted with it's inserted within the practical life of a living being.
Well, and this is precisely the point with Peirce. He argues that we encounter the world in what he calls firstness, secondness, and thirdness, always in relation to some practical pursuit. In fact, one of his most illuminating examples is about baking a pie. But secondness, which he identifies with actual existence, is also praxematic or pragmatic. We might say that the bulk of what is actually done, we might say that the bulk of what is actually done consists of secondness, or better, secondness is the predominant character of what has been done.
I seem to remember that Peirce also uses the image of pushing up against a stuck door to illustrate an encounter with this secondness.
Right. But just before he gets there, he talks about how that which gives actuality is opposition. The fact, he says, takes place. It has its here and now, and into that place it must crowd its way. For just as we can only know facts by their acting upon us and resisting our brute will, so we can only conceive a fact as gaining reality by actions against other realities.
So that's the shoulder against the door, the resistance that pushes back against our efforts, our acting in the world.
Yeah, and for Peirce, this is just what actuality is, resistance or opposition. But to come back to the De Anima, we can say that the soul reaches out to the world and is met, and that which is met is not constituted by our reaching out, and so there's resistance. But it is not at the same time completely independent of that reaching out. It emerges within the world of action, praxis, of those beings who need to act in interchange with the world simply in order to be.
So with Peirce, the interchange that is secondness, with all of this, we're back at the beginning of the De Anima, because Aristotle begins the story of his encounter with the soul by celebrating the nature of the knowledge we have of it. Having seen the soul, our very familiarity with it is said to contribute in particular to the truth about nature. But he goes on to say that this is, quote, because the soul is in some way the principle of living things.
Yes, and you've emphasized many times whenever Aristotle hedges with correlatives like oion, we ought to heighten our awareness that something philosophically interesting is unfolding in the text.
Yeah, and here at the beginning, Aristotle is hedging about the beginning itself, about the word arche, which means principle in the twofold sense Reiner always used to emphasize. It means to begin, incipience, or to govern, command.
And it might have dimensions of both, which would explain Aristotle's hedging. For the soul may be the beginning of life and the governing principle of it, but this latter worries me.
The traditional form of academic critique phrased in the form of worries.
Okay, I take your point. But I think we need more candor and playfulness, more friendship in philosophy. So let me just be more direct. I worry that once the soul becomes the governing principle of life, then, as Aristotle says in Book 1 of the Metaphysics, it becomes available to Sophia, and thus it becomes intellectualized, robbed of its very character of living.
Okay, wait a minute. I'm not so sure why you're divorcing intellection and life. In Metaphysics Book 12, for example, Aristotle identifies the thinking of thinking, namely God, as the highest kind of life, though I myself have been struggling with that text for decades. Part of my struggle with it may be at the heart of your worry, for how this governance works seems to be our shared concern. Here, I want to point again to the duplicity of the notion of arche.
Duplicity, that's a bold claim.
Well, and I mean it. I mean, duplicity refers to the dimension of deception endemic to every beginning. Beginnings are duplicitous in two ways. First, as we've said, there are the dimensions of command and incipience in every attempt to begin. But second, the thetic dimension of commanding is often covered over in ways that allow those who begin to shift responsibility for this positing to an authority that gives the beginning itself legitimacy. This, if I'm not mistaken, is what worries you, and it worries me too.
Yeah, it's the covering over of the static moment, the more or less willful abdication of responsibility to the aesthetic dimension of every beginning as an attempt to locate authority and legitimacy as something objective and certain.
Right, but did you notice what just happened?
You mean my worry became yours?
Yeah, and that happened because we held each other accountable to a shared concern about the manner in which the principles function, a concern that, if I'm not mistaken, has shaped our friendship from its earliest beginning.
True, and it was an insistence on candor in the spirit of playfulness that brought us to a moment of truth in our investigation into this touchstone sentence at the beginning of the Anima.
So maybe the place to begin again.
Are we finally beginning the paper?
Yeah, we should begin with the question of beginning. We should begin with the question of beginning so that we might bring it back to life in the context of friendship. Fix that. For while life itself always embarks upon new beginnings, friends hold us accountable to the unfolding of beginnings in ways that might enable us to resist practices of hegemonic theticism.
Those aesthetic practices are so often rooted in a deep discomfort with the finite nature of life, with the endings that also belong to the beginnings of life. As Sherman would have emphasized, natality and mortality are the ultimates that condition life.
And an inability to inhabit this monstrous sight between birth and death, to tarry with the uncertain but generative moments of beginning without positing something foundational on which to rest assured, may be at the root of our thetic tendencies.
But if this is true, that is, if in our conversation here, this has shown itself as true in our willingness to tarry together in dialogue with the beginning, where does this leave our inquiry into the De Anima? Where does it leave us with our paper?
Yeah, the paper is now a real problem. And I'm not sure I agree any longer with what we wrote, or perhaps I agree with it, but as an earlier iteration on the path to the deeper truths toward which we seem to be heading.
All right, well, let's go back to the soul as the interchange with life through which life itself shows itself as capable of beginning in ways that current.
Okay, but now it's not just life. It's not just that life shows itself, but that it appears between us. That is, the interchange is not simply between the self and the world as mediated by the soul, but between the world and the selves that encounter it and one another with it. The soul then seems at once to be that which opens us to beginnings, allows us to recognize their duplicity, and enables us to transform the violence endemic to bear life into something more meaningful. I don't want to throw around the idea of violence lightly, but it seems that living requires a certain form of violence that might be linked back to the deceptive side of arche, to the tendency to cover over the thetic moment of every beginning. But living well, at least as we developed it in the paper, would involve owning that violent nature of life and perhaps the soul's collusion in it. In taking up its own thetic operations, the soul might avoid what Derrida calls the worst violence.
Oh man, I wish we had argued in our paper that living well is a way of taking up that violence and avoiding the worst violence. And I understand your reticence to use the term violence when one is talking about theory. But our way of taking up Aristotle just now allows us, I think, to uncover the ways in which there is everyday violence that is really deserving of the name.
And this is where I thought you were going in your work on purse and effectivity and the effectivity of social structures. Living well might require habits of recommencing, practices of returning together to the thetic moments of beginning, recognizing them as essential and yet in need of mitigation. Cultivating habits of recommencing requires deliberative attention, and as Aristotle would emphasize, intentional practice.
Doesn't he, in returning again and again into the beginning and being willing in his thinking to begin again from another starting point, model precisely those habits of recommencing?
Yeah, and perhaps we too, in our practices of reading together, have begun to follow in Aristotle's footsteps in this regard. The shape of his texts so often performed this habitual returning to the beginning so that it might proceed again in more just and beautiful ways.
And now, in our apparent inability to start our paper, we might be following Aristotle down this road.
We just might be.
Okay, then let's return to the beginning. Let's try to begin our paper.
And it seems that familiarity, gnosis, of it, symbolesthein, greatly contributes greatly toward all truth, and especially to the truth concerning nature. The soul is, in a certain sense, the principle of living things.
Wait, Chris. Now, as you read it again, I'm hearing it slightly differently. In this phrase, the principle of living things, I'm now starting to hear this duplicity of beginning. The thetic force presses us to understand the soul as what governs life, what rules it. Even if Schumann would be sighing in his Teutonic way right now about the limits of metaphysics, this hegemonic sense of arche remains, I think. But still, I also hear the more incipient side of arche, the soul as somehow the beginning of life.
Yeah, this incipient reading is developed further in the De Anima itself. It is, after all, a text about psyche, which he defines as an ousia, as the eidos of a natural body, somatas physikon, potential with life, and the substance is an actuality, an entelechia. So the soul is the actuality of such a body. That's at 412a20.
But do you see how you bring up a definition that seems steeped in metaphysical drippings? How am I not supposed to read this metaphysically?
So if I capitulate for a moment that this definition of the soul is carried out using terms central to Aristotle's metaphysics, and even if I capitulate for a moment that these terms seem at first glance to have a more or less traditionally understood meaning, still the definition hinges precisely on the notion of zoe, of life. It could be that what constitutes life, that in which life consists, resists a metaphysical reading of these terms.
Okay, maybe I see your point. Certainly Aristotle sees a difference between those natural bodies that are capable of or are actually living and those that aren't living and not capable. But now I'm thinking about his emphasis on two main characteristics, if not goals of life, nutrition and reproduction. He keeps insisting that nothing that is alive is incapable of nutrition and reproduction.
And I would insist that Aristotle never turns his attention away from that basic point, nor that basic model.
Model in what sense?
Well, I mean that life as nutrition is, in the end, life as interchange. Nutrition just is the going outside of itself of a body to find something other than itself. And if it were not other, then it would not be necessary for the body. And then bringing it back and making it one's own. Nutrition and alimentation are quite simply an interchange between living body and world.
I'm tempted to use the word appropriation here.
Why not? We already noticed this feature of the soul of its making its own. And so to use your Latin instead of Heidegger, it would be the act of making proper, of appropriating.
Yes, yes. But then, if nutrition is the minimum of what counts as life, as living, then the soul, which is, for Aristotle, as you mentioned, the ousia of this living, then the soul is the site of interchange between world and living body.
But isn't that the same with sensing? Isn't sensing also going out to the world, encountering it, and bringing the world back and making it one's own? But here we also need to insist on interchange, because Aristotle says, now it is clear that the sentient exists not in activity, but only potentially.
Yeah, yeah. And then if nutrition, okay. The world then must already be there as perceivable, just as it is there as edible. There would be no living things, no plants, no animals, no humans, if the world weren't encounterable as edible. But then you're saying that the world is also there as encounterable in touch and hear and taste and smelling and see it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm now thinking, which we didn't put in the paper. And in each sense, or in each act of sensing, by means of a particular sense, the soul reaches out, that is, with the organs of touch, and the world reaches back as touchable. In this way, touch does touch the thing, but it encounters it as touchable insofar as touchable. But this can only be the case if the world is touchable. That's what I think we meant by interchange and also encounter.
Well, that's all well and good until we come to the last book of De Anima, the book where nous seems to get to the toti anena. You can't, at that point, argue that the soul reaches out by means of nous and encounters the world insofar as it is nousable.
Okay, I'm not happy with the Greeklish, but yeah, that's exactly what I think Aristotle argues in De Anima. In Book 3, Aristotle says something like, the intellect, when in actuality or energia, is the things, ta pragmata. Wait. Just hear, I know you hear what Adorno calls identity philosophy, but in the next chapter, Aristotle says that just as the capacity of sensing is a form, an eidos of sensible, so nous is a form of what is able to be thought. So the analogy is fairly strong between nous and aesthesis, but aesthesis was already thought on the model of nutrition.
Okay, fair enough, but aren't we a long way now from Zoe? Is thinking, nous, a way of or a form of life? I find it's hard to think outside of either a metaphysical preference for eidos or an epistemological preference for pure thought over what belongs to the body, that is, over nutrition, reproduction, and sensation.
Well, I've been obsessed with this move Aristotle makes already in chapter 8 of book 2. There, he's already into his discussion of sensation and has argued that the correlate to hearing is sound, but then he wonders about what makes a sound. There's a physical answer. A sound is made when one body strikes another. He's quite specific here. I have it in my notes. For a sound is a motion of that which can be moved in the manner in which a thing rebounds when it is caused to strike a smooth surface.
But this must have a correlate in some organ of the body.
Right. He then goes on to wonder about voice or phone. Continuing the physical analysis, Aristotle says, quote, now, in the case of vocal sounds, nature uses the air inhaled for two functions, And thus, as it uses the tongue for taste and communication, and just as he uses the tongue as taste for communication, communication of thoughts for the sake of living well, also for voice, which is for the sake of living well.
Wait. Are you being too slippery and now saying, on the basis of just this single quote, that the metaphysical reading of the De Anima is wrong? This is the kind of thing that always worried me about Schurman's reading, and also Heidegger's and many others, namely that his reading took a few passages as central to understanding a text without any argumentation. And now we are moving from speaking of living to speaking of living well. How can you or we justify such a quick move?
Well, I have no idea to do with our paper now. We're just too far into this preparatory chatting to ever recover.
These are the moments I love. Here's the spokesperson for dialogue, for community, for philosophy in public and with others. And now you're worried that we dialogue too much? Oh God, now you've just made me use dialogue as a verb.
Sean, can you at least make copies of the real paper available? Wait, on second thought, I feel like we've gotten into things here just now and that we don't cover in the paper. So maybe we should revise our paper and then you could send it to everyone. Sean, to Sean will say something, okay?
But back to the problem we stumbled into. So I get that Aristotle recognizes that there's a correlation, I mean that literally, correlation between world and living body. And I think that in De Anima, Aristotle is always concerned with what today we might call the issue of mediation. What I mean by this is that if a living body requires other, different, necessarily different bodies in order to be living, he wants to think about the how. That is, in what way can or does a living body reach out to the world and bring the world back? At least when it comes to nutrition and perception, that answer is an organ. Then you raise an argument Aristotle makes about the organ of taste, that is the tongue.
Well, I thought you were getting at this with your reference to purse.
I didn't think I was, but maybe I did accidentally. Maybe you can tell me what I meant.
This is something I've seen in working together. The implications and full significance of what you're thinking and saying are brought out by the other, sometimes in surprising ways.
The door against which my shoulder pushes.
Yes, but more than that, I thought you brought up purse in relation to De Anima in order to show that the encounter works in both directions. The soul encounters the world, but the world encounters the soul. Otherwise, what is the point of the term resistance? Without this working in both directions, resistance would never occur, only force.
Yeah. But then to come back to the De Anima, the model, as we talked about before, must be a responsiveness in both directions. If I start out from the living thing, it needs to eat, to breathe, as Aristotle never tires of reminding us, to reproduce. In each of these activities, the soul requires a world, requires nature, requires an ethos and an environment.
Okay, but do I go too far to push this a bit more in this way? If a living thing needs to eat, it can only eat what is edible. So therefore, when the living thing reaches out to the world for food, the world reaches back, and sometimes not in a good way. So there's a responsiveness of the world to the soul as much as the soul responds to the world. And the response is not always furthering of living, let alone of living well. The stems of rhubarb are edible, the leaves, not so much.
No, I agree that Aristotle is arguing just that. But, and maybe now I'm the one pushing too far, the same holds for the sensitive and the intellective. Sensing, and for lack of a better term, nuising, is just this responsiveness of the soul to the world and world to soul. Sensing reaches out to the world, and the world reaches back insofar as it is sensible, and the same would go for nous.
Yes, and this is the very point Woodbridge suggested was the key to understanding Aristotle. But then, can we say this mutual responsiveness is actually what Aristotle means by living well?
Now I'm going to be the one to push us beyond the text, but you pull me back if you think I've gone too far.
Wait, you, Rick, might engage in excess? Shocked. I'm shocked to hear this.
No, it's just that in our conversation, we've seen the interesting moments in which Aristotle moves from living to living well. For those beings that live through nutrition, that entails that the plant responds to its world, and the world responds in ways that enrich the plant. The plant, however, has no power of locomotion, and so its responsiveness to the world is limited by to go back to what we said earlier, the kind of body that is in soul. With sensation also comes locomotion, and in this way, the sensitive living thing, that is the animal, can also be responsive to its world.
And this is exactly what I think we've been talking about in reference to the de anima. In book 2, I think it's chapter 6, Aristotle says something like each sense has its sensible correlate. He goes on to say that each sense cannot be mistaken about that which is proper to it. So I take it that this must mean that when the soul reaches out to the world by sensing, the world responds with what is sensible by that particular sense.
Fair enough. I can already see this would apply to souls that are able to nous, that is, to think or understand. Those souls reach out to the world through thought, and the world responds with what is thinkable in things.
And knowing your love of Adorno, let me insist on the Aristotelian point. The world responds to thought with what is thinkable, not in the end with the existence of the thing.
Yeah, this is where I was driving. You know me better than I know myself. That's friendship. If the world responds to sense with what is sensible and to thought with what is thinkable, then living well would include responding well.
And being responsible or even accountable to that which is not what is sensed or thought. There is a connection between responding and being responsible. Isn't that what interchange means?
You know, in a real sense, that's exactly what I find in our interchange with one another, our friendship. When we work together, even on this paper that obviously now we're not going to be able to give. Sean, we've used almost all of our time, right?
Yeah, well, if that's the case, then we should circle back to the beginning of our relationship for sure, but also back to the beginning of the de anima. There, Aristotle, as a philosopher, shows that we can only think psyche as interchange in an encounter already underway. And maybe this too is the principle that the soul is, a returning back to beginnings.
I smell you driving toward natality, but let me remind you, as Schumann pointed out, natality has a aesthetic and therefore universalizing gesture. The difficulty for him is that we are caught between the aesthetic universalizing thrust of natality, beginning, conception, and the singularizing thrust of mortality. This is what pushes him into the issue of the double bind that he sees as characteristic of tragedy. A life that is always returning back to the arte is a life on his account that is constantly characterized by the drive for universal, much like Aristotle's account of nous, where there also seems to be a universalizing drive.
But wait a minute. I thought your digression to this whole thing, of course, has been a digression, or maybe the paper we wrote was a digression. But your digression into Peirce, you were showing that there might be a universality already belonging to the singular and a singularity belonging to the universal.
Well, I don't think I got that far, but you're right. Let me illustrate this with Peirce's own example. If I want to bake, for example, an apple pie, I need some apples. The difficulty is that I don't need apples in the world, or according to him, not exactly. What I need for Peirce are qualities like tartness, sweetness, color, etc.
Well, it's already interesting to note that Peirce, like Aristotle, begins with interchange between a soul and the world as it presents itself to and in sense, and both begin with what is closest.
Yeah, and this, just like for Aristotle, is for Peirce always singular. That is, I don't see green in general. I see this green, and this actualizes my power of sensing. So what is sensed is always singular. And here I can't help but make an aside to this aside that is presenting our paper. In book 3, Aristotle indicates that, as they will come to say in the Middle Ages, nothing is in the intellect that was not first in sense. This becomes one of the central points of contention between nominalists and realists.
Maybe that's not such an aside because Peirce himself weighed in on this debate on the side of realism. At least that's what I learned from Doug Anderson.
That's true, but he landed, at least early on, with Duns Scotus, because Scotus's realism was what Peirce called a hair's breadth phenomenon. And now that you push me here, it's not so much of a digression as it might seem. Duns Scotus is never a digression. If we go back to baking the apple pie, I need apples. and yet I never encountered it, at least initially. However, the qualities that I do encounter are already encountered as belonging to something. And in this, Aristotle would agree, at least as we were reading the De Anima together. While, for example, color is the antekeimenon of sight, I see the thing that has color. So for Peirce, when I encounter, let's say, green, it is the green of the apple, and the predication of green of the apple is for him already implicit in the experience. In his strange language, firstness already moved towards second, already opens on to that something to which I initially experienced, opening on to that something to which what I initially experienced belongs. It is this pragmatic situation that shows that the absolute singularity of the quality belongs to something more general, firstness and second. And if that's the case, there's already something mediated that is bringing the two together, and that's what he calls thirdness. So through Scotus, Peirce finds a way to think about singularity and generality in a way in which generality, including universality, is not what Sherman calls aesthetic gesture. Rather, if there is an interchange, generality brings us back to singularity, and singularity always implies generality. Wait, hold on a second.
Yeah.
I think we can cut.
Are you paused?
Yeah, I paused.
Okay. All right.
And
I'm also worried now. I got to go to.
Yeah. So just so you know, well, I think.
Geez, this is still going on. We got quite a bit more here, or like we're already at what? What's our time here?
An hour.
All right. We got to cut.
Yeah. Well, first I'm going to cut your introduction, and then my whole thing there about SCOTUS and everything.
Okay, but I put it somewhere because that's good. But I mean, okay, since we have to, we'll have to stop here for now. But we need. Actually, I feel like at the end of 19, when we go back to when we have it, or where is it? Wait a minute. Yeah, well, I guess maybe on 20 when you say, you know, we've used almost our time, like we could try to wrap things up pretty quickly after that. Or I don't know, maybe we need to cut more at the beginning so we can get to this stuff on living well.
Yeah. What I'm thinking is right here. I know you have to go, but we should cut out maybe some of this. So I like the mentality.
Yeah.
But what if we just cut out this whole return back to person? Because below, if I remember correctly, we return for a third time back to first. So if we end with my saying, there seems to be a universalizing thrust, everything from there until we're going to need some transition. But pick up again when I say, well, we've been talking about how to live well means to go outside.
Right. Well, we're going to have to figure out where we're cutting. I mean, we have to cut pretty large chunks because I don't think we're going to have a whole hour, are we?
I think we might have 45 minutes.
Oh, yeah. All right. Then we're going to have to do some serious cutting.
Yeah. Do you want maybe, so we're together again on Monday, is that right?
Yeah, let me see. Yeah.
So do you want each of us to try to do some of that before then, or do you want to take that on when we're together?
I think we better try to do some of that, but it's hard to cut when we're not, you know, when we're not having the conversation. But maybe
Well,
but I guess
yeah,
if we track the changes, then we're okay.
yeah.
What if we just went and accepted all the changes up to this point?
That's fine.
So
You and
that
I, by the way, you and I actually, we have a conflict. Uh,
we have a conflict on here?
yeah.
Did it just happen?
No, we both edited the same text at the same moment while we were talking.
Oh, I see. Oh, I let me see where is that?
Um, well, oh, here it is at the top of 14. Yes, but, yes, but we should begin with the question of beginning so we can bring it back to life in the context of friendship.
Okay.
So I'll accept that change.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, why don't we just keep tracking changes and let's try to start cutting. Um,
Okay. All right. So for Monday we'll try to have I mean we didn't even get to we got like what 4 more pages.
yeah.
All right. Well, we'll just have to I wonder if we ought to save that document as a different name.
Okay.
And then just so we don't lose it, you know?
All right.
And then then I always feel better about cutting the heck out of something if I know I have the original somewhere.
Right. So I'll call it the dialogue original
Yeah.
version.
Yeah. All right. And then just say and then we'll keep the dialogue as
Right.
the Okay. All right. I'll try and take a look at that over the weekend and then we'll talk on Monday.
Cool.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Take care, man.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.